clear what happens next, but this is very worrying. It would be extremely worrying for the region to see a new front open up between, for example, Saudi and the Houthis, not least on a day when we see news of these incoming drones from Iran-backed militia in Iraq. What's the industry saying about oil prices, oil supply at this point? And we've seen prices come off a little bit. Obviously, this lull in fighting has taken the heat out of oil prices over the past 24 hours or so. What's the current thinking in the industry?
So it's fascinating. It's sort of two camps right now. The one that's the trading camp, focusing on the fact that President Trump has paused on any strikes in Iran. That is the reason that we're seeing a huge drop in Brent crude and WTI prices, because they're seeing that as potential de-escalation, perhaps some kind of diplomatic off-ramp. The reality in the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb Strait, completely different. I spoke to the Maersk CEO a little earlier today, and they were looking at the data. In the Strait of Hormuz, over Saturday, Sunday, and today, there were only 78 vessels, Becky, that transited the Strait of Hormuz, 58 of which are the ones that were not flagged by Iran. And those all opted for the northern route, the Iranian route. We're talking about a trickle of vessels on a daily basis. If you look at what's happening in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the industry is very concerned around a further escalation, including Saudi Arabia. What is encouraging, I guess, in the Red Sea is that Chinese-linked vessels, despite them carrying Saudi oil, have been able to negotiate transit through the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So it's still very tenuous, but it seems that Iran, as well as the Houthis, are trying to formalize again some kind of control in both of the straits.
Well, the Pentagon has updated its war casualty database, adding more than 140 wounded and restoring 4 soldiers killed in Iranian strikes last weekend since the US launched its war with Iran on February the 28th. 18 US troops have died and 624 have been wounded. Now, this comes after the Pentagon faced scrutiny last week when an apparent data glitch on the website meant the casualty numbers actually decreased. Well, CNN's Davis Winky joining me from Atlanta for more. And understandably, people now seeking further detail on the latest casualties, the updated figures, who they are, how they were injured, and why it is that these numbers were reduced over the weekend, not increased. Davis, what do we know at this point?
Becky, this saga is really interesting in that it goes a lot to show the way that this Pentagon's approach to transparency breaks from that of previous administrations. They've been treating the Defense Casualty Analysis System, this online database, as the ongoing source of truth that the public and the media can access for updated information on war casualties. The issue with that, though, is that we've been observing this website on a minute-by-minute basis for a week at this point, and we saw data fluctuations. We saw numbers changing from minute to minute. And those fluctuations, when they would appear on the website and be reproduced by people who are looking to it as the source info for casualty info, led to widespread scrutiny, whether it was from the media, and it also came from some lawmakers. The 12 Democratic senators on the Senate Armed Services Committee wrote a letter to the Pentagon, the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, last Thursday, demanding answers on the issues with the database. They updated it over the weekend to add these additional casualties, as you said, and they also added a new category called overseas operations, which is distinguished from their Operation Epic Fury category, Epic Fury being the first phase of the Pentagon's war with Iran. The new overseas operations category is interesting because it doesn't have a ton of information on the where these things occur, how these things occur, and we're waiting on clarifying info from the Pentagon on that. But the really important bit is that it starts on July 7th. That's significant, Becky, because the Trump administration says July 7th is when a new conflict with Iran began for the purposes of the War Powers Act. You know, the U.S., the president has 60 days to conduct military action before they need congressional approval to continue. Trump admin said that clock stopped from the first phase of the war when they declared the ceasefire in April. What with the new period of the conflict starting on July 7th. That's the significance of why we're seeing the new category pop up to align with that date moving forward. Becky?
Begin with fears of new fronts opening up as conflict grips the Middle East and beyond. In a stunning development, Iran claiming Ukraine attacked one of its vessels in the Caspian Sea over the weekend. Tehran says at least one person was killed and is now threatening retaliation. Fighting has also intensified between Saudi Arabia and the Iran-backed Houthi rebels. This image from NASA appears to show a plume of smoke rising around a Saudi refinery after the Houthis claimed strikes on Saudi infrastructure. All this despite US military operations against Iran appearing to be on hold. But even though the US is signaling new diplomatic efforts, Tehran suggests otherwise.
No, do not pay much attention to the media speculation. As I said, we currently have no negotiations with America. The negotiations that we have, and which may genuinely be subject to different interpretations, are the negotiations we have with Oman. They are focused on creating the necessary arrangements regarding the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, Nick Robertson has the regional reaction. He's in Jerusalem for you today, while Zachary Cohen is in Washington. Nick, let's start with you. And what do we understand happened in the Caspian Sea, and how concerned should we be at this point about this conflict, that between the US and Iran, expanding into a new front?
It certainly has all the characteristics that could happen. The Caspian Sea, of course, has been used to connect Iran and Russia for a long time, trading across it. And what Iran is saying about this incident, they're saying that a ship that was coming from Astrakhan at the northern end of the Caspian Sea was traveling carrying steel to Iran. Anzali was the port, Bandar Anzali at the southern end of the Caspian Sea, about 600 miles away, about 1,000 kilometers. And that's what the Iranians say was struck, a vessel simply coming from Russia to them carrying raw steel, and one person was killed and 3 were injured. Now, President Zelensky in Ukraine, his understanding of their strike, a Ukraine strike, is different. He says that this was an Iranian ship, or a ship, bringing Iranian weapons to Russia. And as we know, Russia has been using, over the last more than 4 years, Shahed and other types of drones that have been made in Iran and supplied to Russia. Russia's learnt from those drones, augmented them, supplemented them, but lent heavily at times on Iran's support for weapons to be used in Ukraine. So from President Zelensky's point of view, that was a legitimate target. And the Ukrainians, for about the past 8 or 9 months, have been targeting Russian facilities inside the Caspian Sea. They've hit an oil terminal there, as well as some other shipping. But the crunch point of what you're saying here is, does this escalate the war? And if you listen to what Iranian leaders are saying, we've heard from the spokesman at the foreign ministry in Tehran and other senior Iranian officials saying Ukraine should not expect to get away with this. They should expect there to be a response. And one senior parliamentarian in Iran said, you know, the US and Israel have learnt that lesson. So Iran is very clearly signaling that it would choose a military response to Ukraine. And in that context, suddenly the war between the US and Iran and in the Gulf just balls westwards and has a whole other potential theater of military operation for the Iranians. They haven't done anything yet. They're speaking about it. In the past, when they've spoken about it, they do follow
retaliation.
through.
Yeah, absolutely. Zach, let me bring you in here. You've reported that J.D. Vance and General Dan Kane have raised concerns about any further escalation with Iran. Just explain what you've explain your reporting and what you've learned.
Yeah, Becky, prior to this temporary pause in U.S. military strikes, we know that President Trump was considering his options to potentially escalate the conflict and convened a meeting with his top advisors at the White House on Friday. And it was during this meeting, we're told, that both Vance and General Dan Kane, his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both raised concerns about potentially escalating the conflict, regardless of which option the president may have chosen there. And that's for a few reasons. Kane, we're told, specifically raising concerns about a diminishing stockpile of key U.S. munitions, including air defense systems like the ones not only used by U.S. forces, but also regional partners in the Middle East and beyond, really key to defending these countries and these U.S. military installations around the world from incoming ballistic missile attacks and, in some cases, incoming drone attacks. And they've expended a significant number, the U.S. has, of those munitions during this conflict in Iran so far. And this is something we've reported on since back in April, where these critical stockpiles have been diminishing because they are firing more missiles and using more of these munitions than they can replace. And they're doing it faster than they can replace them. And so that was one of the concerns raised by Kane during this meeting. But we're also told that Kane also warned of several other potential second and third order effects if Donald Trump did move to escalate the military campaign against Iran, including things like a massive civilian casualties inside Iran if the U.S. were to do things like strike civilian infrastructure, energy, power plants, bridges, things of that nature, as well as potentially sparking a refugee crisis if this conflict ultimately started to spiral out of control. That's something we know that General Kane and other advisors in this meeting were warning President Trump about ahead of this temporary pause, saying that the threat of regional escalation was very real. And that's something we've heard also from regional officials as well, saying that they're really focused on trying to keep this contained. And it goes to what Nick was reporting about the potential of a second front. That's something I think all parties, the U.S. included, are trying to avoid.
Yeah, and I want to get back to Nick to talk about what we are seeing and hearing from Saudi at this point, because again, you know, the risk of this sort of very focused US-Iran conflict expanding around the region, again, very high at this point. Before I do that, Zach, while Vance and Kane were warning about escalation, we continue to hear from sort of Republican lawmakers, you know, the drumbeat for a tougher approach by the US. And I want our viewers to listen to this newly surfaced footage of the now late Lindsey Graham speaking recently with Benjamin Netanyahu. Have a listen.
I'm going to meet with the president this weekend. I'm going down to Doral. I'm going to try to get him to join with y'all in Lebanon to maybe fly some with you. Would you like that?
Yeah, I get that. I think you have a point, but I've been thinking about the other side of it for a second. We're concentrating right now on Iran. If we tell Hezbollah that we're going all the way, we threaten them, but if we actually do it, then they have no reason not to go all the way against us. And right now, that's not our interest. We can do it later.
Well, well, that's actually good counsel. I'll put it out there as an idea. We can always go back to it.
Interesting, Zach, and it also speaks to the sort of multi-dimensional sort of sense of this regional conflict. What do you think that tells us about the divide in Washington over what's going on?
Yeah, Becky, inherently within the Republican Party itself, we've actually seen a fracturing take place over the Iran war. There is really an anti-interventionist wing of the Republican Party, including many supporters of President Trump who really leaned into his message on the campaign trail of not starting any new wars and do feel betrayed, and you're seeing this reflected in political polling here in the U.S., betrayed by this extended conflict that the U.S. now finds itself in. And at the same time, there are still members of the Republican Party, including some of the more institutional senior lawmakers on Capitol Hill, who are pushing for President Trump to take an even stronger stance against Iran. One phrase I continue to hear from those type of hawkish officials is they want President Trump to, quote, finish the job. Yet I've still, in conversations I've had over the last several weeks even, it's still unclear to me what that even would look like. The administration's goals in this conflict have shifted so many times, and President Trump has reiterated over and over again that the objective is to prevent Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon. But at this stage in the conflict, there appears to be no viable or immediate path, militarily or diplomatically, toward achieving that. And so you do have these two sort of competing motives and intentions within the Republican Party itself. And you're seeing President Trump sort of wrestle with that in real time as he sort of swings in his public messaging between very bombastic language, threatening Iran on social media like he did over the weekend, but then also insisting that they want to make a deal and pushing his advisors and negotiators to continue talking. So ultimately, it sort of results in a situation where the U.S. and the president seems to find himself stuck in a way. And it will be interesting to see with the midterms coming up here in the U.S. especially how that looming election might impact how the Trump administration handles this going forward.
And it's a question that people around the Gulf region, the GCC, are asking themselves too. Nick, it is the Gulf, of course, and Lebanon, which is still in the crosshairs. And I've got to get your response today to what is going on in Saudi. We have seen strikes claimed by the Houthis over the weekend on oil infrastructure there, and some reporting today that has been responded to by the Defense Ministry in Saudi of drone attacks by Iran-backed militia from Iraq. What's your perspective on what we are seeing in that front, as it were?
Yeah, it's complex. Let's try and boil it down and make it simple. Take the big picture look. Saudi Arabia, massive country on the Arabian Peninsula, massive amount of oil wealth underneath its ground, significant number of oil terminals scattered all across the country, in the east, in the sort of northeast, and other vital places across the country. Yet on its longest borders, to the north, Iraq, it has the hostile Iran-backed Iraqi, the long border in the north with Iraq. It has the hostile Iran-backed Iraqi militias that have a history, and a very recent history even today, of attacking Saudi Arabia. It has a huge long border with Yemen in the south, where the Houthis hold sway, and the Houthis, as you say, over the weekend targeting a Saudi oil refinery in Jazan, putting a sort of a dent in its oil storage capacity there, sending plumes of smoke for many tens of miles, if not 100 miles or so, out into the atmosphere. And then just across the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, if you will, again, essentially a long sea border, but across the other side of that border is Iran. Saudi is surrounded by potential adversaries, and they all link back into Iran. So Saudi is in a very difficult position when it comes to how to respond. It needs its Gulf allies and partners. It's warming its relationship with the UAE. It depends on the United States. It has a very sophisticated air force, but its problems cannot be solved simply by air force strikes. This is a situation now where the Saudis must consider very carefully who their friends in the region are going to be. And this gets to what the Abraham Accords that we know Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's left here today. He'll be in Washington tomorrow. He'll be pushing that issue with President Trump. It's very critical for the Saudis how they respond to these different adversaries, because all three can team up at the same time. And going back to their oil facilities around the country, that leaves their wealth incredibly exposed. They don't want to lose the ability, and they've been targeted many times before, to produce their oil. That's their future wealth. That's their dilemma at the moment, Becky.
It's good to have you both. Thank you. I want to introduce into the show this hour a good friend of the show, Jasmine El-Gamal. She's a former Middle East advisor for the U.S. Defense Department, the founder and CEO of Averos Strategy. She's also the host of the podcast The View from Here. She joins us from London today, and it's great to have you. We've just been, I hope you heard, talking there to Zach and to Nick. Washington perspective from Zach, and Nick giving us a sense of what he sees around the Gulf region, not least the thinking for Saudi now and going forward. There, as we enter what is the 6th month of this sort of wider US-Iran conflict, if you want to call it that, what do you make of where we are at?
Becky, it's so good to be with you, as always. Thanks for having me. I think if you look at the trajectory of this war, it really has gone from, President Trump saying that this is going to be a regime change war, saying that to the Iranians that the US was there to help was on its way, talking about the nuclear program as one of the top priorities of the United States, to now where we have this incredible and incredibly delicate convergence of factors and actors that have turned this into something completely, potentially unmanageable if President Trump doesn't kind of take the opportunity to reset. Now, what I mean by that is that there are so many actors now involved. You're talking about Iraq, we're talking about Saudi Arabia and all of the different threats that it faces that Nick so clearly articulated. Kuwait, Qatar, all of these countries that are now looking around them and seeing myriads of threats and trying to figure out how they are going to move forward, dependent on the US and the way it sees the way forward. Is the US going to continue to escalate? Or is the US going to understand that the only solution here is a diplomatic one? But you also have two domestic factors that are thrown into the mix, which is the Israeli elections and the US midterm elections that are both coming up. And we can't discount the political factors that are influencing some of these decisions that have to be made. So the more factors that are introduced and that have been introduced into the mix over the last several months, the more complex and difficult it becomes to solve the issue, because then it becomes about so many different issues. And that's what President Trump, the Iranians, all the actors are dealing with right now, is how to prevent escalation and start looking at all of these different variables and trying to find a diplomatic way to resolve them. It's a very tall order, Becky, and it's a huge challenge. And it's a very, very delicate moment, like I said.
And Jasmine, you will be keenly aware, as I am, when you talk to people around the Middle East, that you get this sort of and certainly have done for about the last 2 or 3 years, this prevailing sort of school of thought that there is an opportunity to navigate a new Middle East, certainly from the perspective of Gulf countries, of Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. But that necessitates dealing with Iran. And so to a degree, what has happened with Iran was sort of expected and encouraged to a degree by countries around the region, although this is sort of the worst case scenario that we've got now into this sort of frozen conflict. And so what happens next, particularly for these Gulf neighbors, is really, really important. CNN reporting that J.D. Vance and General Dan Kane have raised concerns about further escalation with Iran. I wonder whether you see this as pointing to divisions in Washington over how the US goes about this war, how Tehran might view those differences, and the fact that we are 100 days out from the midterms makes any difference at all at this point.
Right, Becky, you bring up two very important points here. One is the shifting dynamics in the region and what is happening within the region, within relationships between different countries in the region in terms of how they want to try to address these issues, and also what's happening inside of Washington. And again, those two dynamics are linked. Now, every person I speak to in the region, in fact, just today, I came from speaking to an official of one of the countries in the region who was telling me that they see this moment in the Middle East as shifting towards a multipolar Middle Eastern moment, in the sense that there are certain analysts, or maybe even in Washington, folks who are trying to turn this into a sort of bipolar kind of linear moment where you have, the Abrahamic countries and the non-Abrahamic countries, of course, speaking about countries that have signed the Abraham Accords. But the issue is so much more complex than that, because if you look at it from the framing of the Abraham Accords, which is what Israel wants, what Prime Minister Netanyahu wants, and what President Trump has recently restated when speaking about the Saudi nuclear deal, you're really making Israel the center of the region and regional concerns, when actually regional concerns are much wider than that. It's about energy diversification. It's about Iran, the relationship with the US, and so many more issues. So so it's important, I think, to kind of take a step back and look at this from this multipolar perspective. Now, when it comes to the conversation in Washington, you're absolutely right that there are two minds right now. One is military action is not working. More of the same is not going to get us closer to what we want to do, which is open up the Strait of Hormuz by force. And that's what General Kane is saying to President Trump. He's saying, look, we can continue to do this militarily, but it just won't get you the response that you want. And then you have those who are arguing for that stepping back that I'm talking about, looking at the issues holistically, looking at the concerns of countries in the region, what Iran wants to gain out of this, and understanding that a diplomatic solution where you bring all of these actors together. And by the way, Qatar and Oman continue to be very active in putting ideas on the table, that is the way forward, is to look at those ideas, examine them, give them the time they deserve, and start moving forward diplomatically, as opposed to this uncontrolled, potentially escalation that we're seeing in the region right now.
It's absolutely fascinating, and the weeks and months to come will be so telling, I think. Look, meantime, in the next 24 hours, we have got Benjamin Netanyahu heading to Washington. Is it clear at this point what his message to Donald Trump will be? What are his intentions with regard Israel's involvement in what is going on? It's stepped back to a degree from the Gulf region, although clearly still very primed on the Lebanon file. What's your sense?
Well, again, you can't separate Prime Minister Netanyahu's conversations with President Trump from Prime Minister Netanyahu's electoral campaign within Israel. And so if you look at his messaging, Becky, he's really framing this visit as a mission. And he used those words. He said this mission to go to the United States. He made sure to mention in his social media post about this visit that it was his 8th visit to the United States, that it is more than any other international leader. So he's really, after weeks and even months of reported tensions between the two leaders, is trying to relay that message to the Israeli public that he has a very close relationship with President Trump, and that it's a consultative relationship, that he's going there to represent Israeli interests and the interests of the state of Israel, but he is also consulting with the US president on the next steps vis-a-vis Iran. Now, whether he is able to convince President Trump to continue to put on the pressure militarily remains to be seen, because this time, given everything we just talked about, Becky, about the potential for uncontrolled escalation and all the different factors that abound, Prime Minister Netanyahu's arguments will be met by very staunch objections and alternative viewpoints from people like General Kane, J.D. Vance, who are saying, look, you've made this case for military action. Look at where it's gotten us. More of the same is not going to work. So this is going to be a really interesting, potentially consequential meeting, both for the way Prime Minister Netanyahu is positioning himself back home, and also for the way forward with the Iran war. And of course, Lebanon as well. We can't You mentioned that in your conversation earlier. Lebanon is also going to be a very important topic in this discussion, and Netanyahu's visit comes on the heels of President Aoun's visit to Washington, D.C., where they had their own conversations, the Lebanese, with the president, making the case for their own national security interests and what they need from the U.S. in the region.
A pause in U.S. airstrikes on Iran amid signs that the war could expand on a new front. Iran is now threatening Ukraine after Kyiv attacked an Iranian vessel in Caspian Sea, the route for much of the country's trade with Russia. Iran says the incident cannot go unanswered. At least one person was killed. Ukraine says it struck ships in the waterway transporting military cargo from Iran to Russia. Now, this all comes as U.S. military operations appear to be on hold for a third night. Washington says it's meant to create space for diplomacy. Iran says it will not allow the U.S. to determine the timing of the war. International diplomatic editor Nick Robertson joins us now from Jerusalem. Good to have you with us, Nick. So after 2 intense weeks of strikes and counterstrikes between the U.S. and Iran, we have this pause. What are you hearing on the ground as to the reason for this pause in operations, and where is diplomatic talks at right now?
Yeah, I think it's broadly understood that the opportunity was given for diplomacy. Certainly that's what we've been hearing from the White House. And the diplomacy that sort of took place during that pause was a team from Oman going to Tehran. They went Friday, they left late Saturday. And they were talking about the Strait of Hormuz, and they're talking about how it's going to be controlled in the future. It's not clear what the output of that meeting was. There was progress, according to the Iranians. It was, there are technical and political talks ongoing subsequently. The Iranian foreign ministry spokesman said at the weekend, but we've subsequently heard from Iranian officials that there's actually no peace talks going on at the moment. And the Iranians have doubled down on their message of blocking ships that are not following their instructions, their legal writ to go through the Strait of Hormuz. 6 ships, they say, have been forced to halt their efforts to get out of the Strait of Hormuz. So it does appear that what was happening in that diplomatic space, we haven't heard a final view from the White House about it, but it doesn't seem to have unlocked the key thing, which was how to proceed, how the United States and Iran can come to an agreement over the Strait of Hormuz. It's not clear how much longer that pause will go on, and it's questionable what that pause means for the wider region. We've just had in the past hour or so drones flying from an Iranian-backed militia inside of Iraq targeting a Saudi oil refinery, and it's not clear yet. Saudi defenses were put up. It's not clear yet if any of those attack drones were able to get through. But if they did, or by virtue of that particular strike itself, it shows that Iran's proxies in the region are still hitting the economic interests of the United States allies in the region. So it's not clear kind of where that ceasefire or pause stands right now.
Right, yeah. So despite what appears to be a quieter battlefield, you've got this conflict expanding geographically. You mentioned the Houthi rebels accused of striking Saudi energy infrastructure, but also I mentioned earlier Ukraine being accused of targeting an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea. What does this all say about the risk for greater escalation involving more countries?
I think it makes it very clear that potential is there. Iranian officials have said that this won't go Ukraine's actions, hitting one of their ships and killing a crew member and injuring 3 others in a drone strike, won't go unanswered. And in the past, when Iran has given this sort of message, it generally follows through. Now, the Iranians are saying that this was a vessel coming from a Russian port, Astrakhan, at the northern end of the Caspian Sea, 600 miles further south to Port Bandar Anzali in Iran. And it was just carrying steel. But we've heard from President Zelensky, who said On the contrary, this was an Iranian shipment of weapons to Russia, and that's why they targeted it. They targeted in the Caspian Sea over the past about 8 months or so. But it's been very well clearly documented that Iran, almost since Russia's war began in Ukraine over 4 years ago, that Russia has been relying on Iranian-made drones and weapons support. So there's contrary messages. But if the Iranians say they're going to strike back, that speaks to a further potential expansion of the war fronts here. The whole issue, the whole tensions over the Strait of Hormuz, over Iran's nuclear weapons, over its proxies like the Houthis, the sort of threat that they have to the region, it is all still very, very much in play. And I think what we're witnessing at the moment is it just bubbling up in different areas, even though the main protagonists are on a pause.
All right, Nick Robertson for us.
All right, turning to U.S. military operations in Iran, which appear to be on hold amid signs that the war could expand on a new front. Tehran is now threatening Ukraine after Kyiv attacked an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea, the route for much of the country's trade with Russia. Ukraine says it struck ships carrying military cargo from Iran to Russia. Iran also says that it will not allow Washington to determine the timing of the war as the U.S. pauses its airstrikes. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations says President Trump is creating space for negotiations.
What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level.
Meantime, global oil prices are sharply lower amid the pause in the Iran war. CNN's Anna Kupin joins us now from London, and we see how delicate the reaction from traders is to the constant news coming out of the Middle East. As soon as there are signs of perhaps more diplomacy, we see a drop in oil prices. When things turn escalatory, they turn around. Just give us a sense of how traders are analyzing all of this.
Yes, well, you're right. It's really sort of very Groundhog Day at the moment. Just a few days ago, we saw oil above $100 a barrel, that real sort of milestone moment. Now it's down, Brent, the global benchmark, down to just under $90 a barrel there. And there are, there's reasons why this is the case. Clearly, there's been a lull in the fighting, and this is a cause for relief among traders. But there are some more structural reasons as to suggest that we're in a position that's slightly, and I emphasize slightly, more positive than we were just a few weeks ago. Parts of the world have gotten used to lower demand for oil in some cases. And then also, during the time that the Strait of Hormuz was kind of basically open, we got over 200 million barrels of oil out. That's according to Lipo Oil Associates. Now, that covers global supply for around 17 weeks. And so that's good news there. China as well has been drawing down its massive stockpiles. We have release of oil from strategic oil reserves across many countries. So this has all been happening on the backdrop. These are bright spots, Biana, however, on a backdrop of a real negative situation. And we've seen over the weekend just a trickle of ships get out of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran as well saying that, the majority of those ships are moving through this approved corridor. Iran clearly still has a grip over the Strait of Hormuz. And then also this war has opened up on a second front in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. We've seen Iran-backed Houthi militants claim to have attacked Saudi oil tankers. And this is the only way that Saudi Arabia can get out a big chunk of its oil. So yes, we're seeing, lower demand in some places, countries drawing on stockpiles, but fundamentally the relief that we're seeing today in the market will probably be quite short-lived if we are to see another protracted closure of the Strait of Hormuz, Biana.
Yeah, we're already seeing reports of the Saudi deflecting, shooting down missiles coming from what is thought to be the Houthis right now as well. Anna Kubin, thank you. Well, as the war with Iran drags on, new worries are emerging. During a meeting on Friday with President Trump, sources tell us the vice president, along with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, raised concerns about escalating the war and the strain it's putting on U.S. weapons stockpile that is getting quickly depleted. Meanwhile, the Pentagon is revising its casualty numbers after coming under fire last week for being slow to update. It reports at least 18 U.S. troops have now been killed and more than 600 wounded since the war began February 28th. CNN's Kevin Liptak joins us from the White House with more. So, Kevin, the president seemingly reversing course. It appeared he was gearing up for a major military escalation just a few days ago. And per reporting that CNN has done along with other media outlets, there were a couple of top-level officials who warned him that the stockpiles, in particular interceptors, are running and depleting rather quickly. Just talk about how that may have influenced his ultimate decision.
Yeah, and there were multiple concerns raised in this meeting on Friday that the president convened with his national security team. And in particular, you heard the Vice President J.D. Vance and General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both raised their misgivings about a potential escalation in the conflict, which President Trump had been previewing publicly and which he seemed poised to give the go-ahead for heading into the weekend. And Dan Kane in particular did raise some of these concerns about dwindling stockpiles of munitions, and in particular the air defense interceptors that the U.S. has used over the course of this conflict to intercept ballistic missiles that Iran has been firing towards American positions in the region. And you saw how that ended in tragedy when that base in Jordan was targeted, that led to the deaths of 3 American service members. Now, we have known for quite some time that this is a concern inside the administration. There's one group in Washington, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that has estimated that the U.S. has used 1,500 Patriot interceptors over the course of this conflict, which would leave about 1,000 remaining. And it's an extraordinary number when you consider these costs. The interceptors cost about $4 million a piece, and some of what they're being used to intercept, which is the drones that Iran has been using, only cost about $35,000. And so there's a mismatch there that the military will have to work out. Now, in this briefing, General Kane did say that if the president wanted to execute on one of the options or any of the options he had in front of him for escalating, that the military would be able to do that and would be able to do it successfully. But nonetheless, these questions do remain about the stocks. Now, the administration over the last couple of days has been forcefully denying that there are problems with the stockpiles. What Mike Waltz, you saw earlier, the American ambassador to the UN, said is that the military, quote, has everything that it needs to conduct this campaign as effectively as it needs to be. But he was also saying that anyone leaking information about the stockpiles deserves to go to jail. And I don't think it's a crime to leak false information. And so there is, I think, clearly some concerns bubbling up underneath the surface. There were also in this meeting concerns raised about the potential for civilian deaths inside Iran, and we know that the president has been openly musing about going after civilian infrastructure, also concerns about a potential refugee crisis. And I think perhaps the biggest concern of all, aside from the stockpiles, is that this may not eventually prove effective in getting the Iranians back to the negotiating table, which is what the U.S. wants to see here if the president is to see this war come to an end. And so I think a lot of questions about whether the president has completely ruled this out. He told Axios earlier today that he would pull the trigger on a major escalation if the Iranians don't come back in a meaningful way to the negotiations. And so it still seems as if it's an open question where this is all heading, but the president holding off on that intensification, at least for now.
Yeah, and Axios also reporting that another factor was CENTCOM Commander Bradley Cooper reportedly suggesting a pause in the constant military strikes in the Strait of Hormuz, saying that in his view they've lost their effectiveness at this point as well. Kevin Liptak, thank you so much. For more on this, I want to bring in retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Karen Gibson. General, thank you so much for joining us. So you just heard that whole setup about the reporting over the weekend. The White House is disputing that, saying there's no stockpile issue, and that if the president were wanting to reengage once again in a massive kinetic strike and campaign, that he has all of the resources and assets that he needs. So which one is it, in your view?
Well, I think both could be true. We could have enough interceptors remaining in the stockpile to wage this war with Iran. But one problem is that these are not just used for this current conflict in the Middle East. This is a weapon system and a munition that we provide to allies, to Gulf partners across the region, to Ukraine, and to East Asian allies. And the shortfalls within the defense industrial base have been known for years. They long predate this administration and the one before it. And the question has always been posed, do we have enough interceptors in the event something happens and we have to defend Taiwan? So this is a weapon system. Yes, we may have enough for the campaign with Iran, but it's going to take a very long time for the industrial base to restock what's been expended. And that has implications for other theaters as well. So in that sense, both could be accurate.
So then explain to both American audiences, the taxpayers who are footing the bill for the Defense Department and supporting our troops and procurement of these weapons, and for viewers abroad who see that the U.S. defense budget balloons, even the number 2 after the U.S. in terms of how much resources, how much money is allocated, trillions of dollars to the Defense Department. So how do you answer the question of why then, after just 4 months of not a fully engaged war with troops on the ground as we'd seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, how are we even having this conversation now about stockpiles?
Well, sure. I think it's fair to say that the people who planned the operation did not predict that it would last this long. And certainly they thought that there would probably be a more rapid capitulation on the part of the Islamic regime. There may have been some assumptions that they won't stop traffic in the Strait of Hormuz because that'll impact their economy. They won't attack other states in the Gulf because they need them to remain neutral. And if the economic well-being of the Iranian people was the foremost priority of the Islamic Republic, those might be the decisions they had made. But I think it's easy to forget that for the men who lead the Republic, they see this as an existential fight for their survival, and they are not making decisions on that calculus. Their strategy all along has been to make the conflict so economically and politically untenable for the United States that the U.S. would back off on some of the concessions they are asking. And they've believed that they can sustain both the U.S. Strikes, airstrikes, and sanction regimes, as well as continue to impose these very asymmetric and punishing retaliatory strikes of their own, and that they believe they have more staying power.
So then, if the original assumption proved to have been a miscalculation on the part of those advising the president who ultimately made the decision to start the war, I think most would agree just backing away right now and wiping your hands clean of the war and calling it over is not really an option for the United States and has global ramifications beyond just the Gulf. What options does he have right now to course correct, especially when you hear what Admiral Cooper reportedly said about these constant strikes around targets over the Strait of Hormuz losing their effectiveness?
Sure. So let's look first at Admiral Cooper's comments. You know, when I look at an adversary's options, I look at 2 things. 1, their will, their intent, their desire, and 2, the capability to execute that. And in this phase of the campaign, which is no longer about imposing enduring curbs on Iran's nuclear program, but it is really about reopening the strait to global traffic, Iran has made very clear that they intend to control that, to develop some kind of administrative construct that they are in charge of. That's their will and intent. And their ability to do so is these one-way attack drones and sometimes missiles. So while the U.S. military under Admiral Cooper has had tremendous tactical effectiveness, destroying many Iranian military capabilities, they haven't eliminated those entirely. It's a very narrow strait, and Iran has a vast geography from which they can attack it. And actually eliminating all of these mobile, easy to hide, relatively easy to produce drones is an exceptionally high bar. Frankly, eliminating it, probably impossible. And then if you look at the other side, Iran's will and intent, they haven't backed off on that either. And so I think, or at least there's no indication that we've moved the needle in that regard. And I think that's probably what Admiral Cooper was getting at, that more of the same is not going to have the effect of reopening the strait. So I think the administration faces two choices in that case. Three, if you consider you could continue to do more of the same. You could escalate, and Kevin previously highlighted some of the risks associated with that. Or you could pause these strikes and see where we are in terms of potential negotiations with Iran, while continuing to sustain the economic blockade, the sanctions regime, and keeping military forces in the region to apply additional pressure if needed. I think that's the dilemma that the administration faces right now.
The temporary pause in U.S. strikes on Iran does seem to be holding at this hour amid growing concerns over the conflict escalating further. Sources telling CNN the president was briefed by Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane on Friday. The general reportedly telling Trump that carrying out more aggressive moves could further deplete stockpiles, along with other potential downsides. Some Republican lawmakers also signaling some uncertainty about the direction of this war.
At some point, date certain, it'll be that Congress has to weigh in. It may be soon, but in my mind, the president's had the opportunity to achieve the initial goals, which I agreed with, to wrap it up. It's not happened. At this point, I do think there needs to be a fuller national discussion as to how we go forward.
Joining us now in the group chat, retired Lieutenant General Karen Gibson, former Deputy Director of National Intelligence and a Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Strategies. General, it's good to have you here. So when we parse through what we're hearing, right, about these concerns that were raised by General Kane, about the military stockpiles in this moment, what does it tell you about the math here?
Well, I think at any time that you're using weapons faster than the industrial base can replenish them, then of course your stockpiles are going to diminish to some point. The question is it dangerous? You know, what kinds of shortages might we encounter? And it's important to remember that it's not just U.S. forces that use these expensive interceptors, but also our Gulf partners. You know, we provide similar kinds of capacity in the past in the Republic of Korea or to Ukraine. And so it can become a global supply problem if we are depleting them too rapidly. And each time that Iran launches missiles or one-way attack drones, it requires the expenditure of these scarce resources.
So to your point, right, about where else these munitions are being used, I want to play a little bit of what we touched on this briefly, but we have the sound now. U.S. Ambassador to the UN Mike Waltz had to say about that specifically.
We inherited a difficult situation with many of our munitions having been given over in Ukraine, a lot of them expended in the Houthis, but we are rebuilding with cheaper, faster, more technologically capable as we are conducting this campaign.
Recognizing, you know, what has happened before, it does beg the question of, shouldn't that have been taken into account before going into this war, knowing that it could last longer?
Yeah, so I would say two things. One, I think the shortfalls in the defense industrial base have been long-standing. It's one of the 4 priorities of the new defense strategy is to rebuild that. But two, certainly I think the initial planning for this campaign did not anticipate that it would go this long.
We have heard from the president about how Iran's military capabilities have been depleted. What are you seeing?
Yeah, so they've been dramatically depleted, right? But not eliminated. And frankly, eliminating them is darn near impossible. You look at the very narrow Strait of Hormuz that we're trying to protect and the vast geography from which Iran can attack it with cheap, relatively easy to produce, easy to hide, one-way attack drones. And when I, as an intelligence professional, look at an enemy's, what they might do, I look at 2 things. One, what is their will and intent? And Iran has been very clear that they intend to control navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. And what is their ability to do so? And in terms of their ability to do so, we've degraded that considerably, but not eliminated it. And in terms of their will and intent, there's really no indications that we've moved the needle on that. They still insist that they will control the straits. And so I'm not sure, well, it's been tactically effective, and tactically we've degraded tremendous capabilities. We haven't achieved our strategic aims.
I just want to ask you one more question on that point. So Aaron David Miller over the weekend was talking on CNN. I spoke with him a little bit about this yesterday. Talking about, when you talk about the will, right, there's also the will of Iranian leadership to keep going and to be able to inflict pain on their own people. That is incredibly strong.
Oh, yes.
And is it proving to be more strong in this moment than you think was anticipated?
Well, I think some people underestimated the willingness, one, of the Islamic Republic or the men who are in charge to absorb pain. And the well-being of the Iranian people has never been a top priority. I think people also forget that for them, this is an existential fight for the survival of the state. And so their willingness and ability to absorb that kind of pain, whether it's in the form of punishing airstrikes or years-long sanctions regimes, is very high. They are not making the kind of calculations that a nation who put their economic likelihood as their top priority would make. You know, I think there were perhaps some assumptions that they won't choke off the strait because it'll hurt them economically. They won't attack Gulf states because they need them to remain neutral. And those are the kind of rational decisions that a nation that was economically minded might make. But when you're in an existential fight for the survival of the Islamic Republic, your calculus is different.
And in terms of the calculus, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but the fact that, and we heard from Senator Cassidy there, right? The fact that congressional funding, right, is going to plays an important role here. Sarah, how do you see all of this figuring in now in this moment as the American people, as we know from every poll that comes out, are increasingly dissatisfied with where things stand?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that Americans don't think about, but you know that military officials think about, strategic officials think about, is if we were to get into a situation where allies depended on us, let's say China were to invade Taiwan, and our stockpile is low. That is a very, very serious long-term national security issue for us. Now, I don't think that the American people are demanding answers to that of their politicians as we head into the midterms. What they are demanding answers on is the economic priorities that you just mentioned, and those things are going to be very, very seriously felt if we cannot figure out the stockpile issues. So, for example, if we cannot figure this out with the strait, if the strait doesn't remain open and we can't get free trade to go through, there's no way gas prices are going down ahead of the midterms. By the way, even if we got the strait open, there's probably no way that they're going to go down in time for midterms. That's the biggest priority for voters right now. And if you're Congress, you don't want to be in a position where you're voting against funding in a way that it's going to come down to the way that it's hitting people's prices at the pump, in grocery stores, and all those things. So they've got some delicate dancing to do. But I do think that the bigger strategic concern is it's not actually about some of these short-term economic pains. It's what do we do if we have no stockpile, China invades Taiwan, our allies in the southeastern part of the world are dependent on us. That becomes a pretty serious problem.
All right, breaking this morning, global oil prices falling sharply. Look at that. Brent crude was up over $100 a barrel at one point last week. Why is it dropping? The United States appears to have paused its bombing raids on Iran. New reporting suggests high-level concerns in the administration about dwindling reserves of U.S. air defense munitions. Let's get ready to CNN's Kevin Liptak at the White House. It's pretty interesting. What's the White House saying about this, Kevin?
Yeah, and we have now had 3 days of relative calm after that 13-day stretch where we saw those night-by-night attacks. And it does come even after the president was threatening this major escalation in Iran. There was a discussion at the White House on Friday discussing both the efficacy of those night-by-night strikes, but also about the potential risks for escalation. And what we're told is that both the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, raised concerns about escalation, and that Kane, in particular, has warned about the potential for dwindling stockpiles of U.S. munitions, including air defense interceptors. Now, the administration strongly denies that that is an issue. What Mike Walls, the American ambassador to the United Nations, said yesterday is that, quote, the military has everything it needs to conduct this campaign as effectively as it needs to be. And also claiming, somewhat contradictory there, that anyone leaking information about weapon stockpiles deserves to be in jail. Now, there were a few other concerns that were raised in this meeting, including the potential for a wider regional retaliation. The president also hearing concerns about the potential for civilian deaths inside of Iran if he went after some of those civilian infrastructure sites that he'd been repeatedly warning he would attack, including bridges, power plants, that sort of thing. Now, what the administration is also saying today is that they want space for the diplomacy to proceed. And I am told this morning that that is still continuing. The mediators, including Pakistan and Qatar, still in discussions to try and get the two sides back to the negotiating table. You also have Iran and Oman discussing ways to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. What you've seen President Trump doing over the weekend is continuing this relatively belligerent approach on social media. He posted almost a dozen AI-generated images of the U.S. seizing oil tankers, of the U.S. striking Karg Island, including oil sites on that very critical export site. Now, the president still continuing to have these diplomatic discussions. He's also expected to discuss the whole situation with the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. He's visiting the U.S. for Lindsey Graham's funeral tomorrow. Israel has made pretty clear that it thinks the U.S. has unfinished business inside of Iran.
Now, a top U.S. official says that President Trump is giving talks with Iran, quote unquote, some space. Now, after nearly 2 straight weeks of nightly bombing, there is also new reporting that suggests that the president is facing growing warnings from within about escalating this further. Fresh concern raised by some of his closest advisors, concern from both the vice president, J.D. Vance, and the Joint Chiefs Chairman, General Dan Kane. According to a source familiar, General Kane even specifically raised worry about depleting the U.S. munitions stockpiles further if the fighting continues. Also, overnight, Iranian officials ramped up their threats towards Ukraine. This is after Ukraine this weekend launched an attack on an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea. Let's talk about where things stand then now with CNN Global Affairs analyst Brett McGurk. He's also the author of the new book coming out, Brink, Inside the Race to Free the October 7th Hostages. It's good to see you. Thanks for being here. So let's talk about, they're in a pause moment. That seems to be, I think, the only clear thing when it comes to the status of this war, because 2 weeks of U.S. bombing runs on Iran have seemed to fail to break the deadlock over the Strait of Hormuz still. And now you have reporting that there's this concern that was raised this week about further depleting munition stockpiles if the president escalates this further. How do they navigate a path forward now, Brett? What do you see here?
Kate, it's tough. You know, we're 5 months tomorrow. We'll be at the 5-month mark of when this conflict started. And I had a saying when I used to work in the White House for various presidents, from General Eisenhower when he was president. He used to say, before we talk about decisive military action, lay out all the facts cold and hard. And it appears from the reporting from CNN and elsewhere that this meeting late last week did that and said, here are all the factors as we consider next steps. That's good. That's exactly the type of information a president should be getting. It's probably the type of meeting that should have been had before this started. But where are we now? I would call this, Kate, a tactical pause. I think we had 13 nights of strikes. There are back channels open through Oman and other to try to get the strait back to where it was before those strikes started 2 weeks ago. And that, I'm told, they're making some progress. So tactical pause, let's see where we are, see if diplomacy can get somewhere. But otherwise, we're still kind of stuck because the key variable remains the Strait of Hormuz. And if Iran is not going to is going to maintain that the Strait of Hormuz is its sovereign territory, it controls what goes through the strait, I don't see Washington accepting that, nor do the Gulf states accept that, and therefore you're kind of stuck. So it's a big week, Kate. We got visits coming to Washington. Netanyahu's here, Zelensky's here. We'll see the diplomacy go, but right now, tactical pause.
Well, let's talk about the new Zelensky factor, if you will. Ukraine this weekend attacking this Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea. This is a route for much of Iran's trade with Russia. Iran responding with warnings. The new one coming overnight from an Iranian regional governor is Ukraine, too, may soon come to understand that Iran does not let actions go unanswered. What does this do?
Kate, this is first of all, let's step way back. Iran has been supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine directly. They provide Shahed drones. They provide technology. Russia now has a factory producing these Iranian Shahed drones, which allows Iran to prosecute its war. This has been going on for years. And Zelensky, about 3 days ago, said that the Ukrainians struck a ship in the Caspian Sea carrying military material between Russia and Iran. Iran is now claiming that this is basically an act of war, and Iran is now threatening to attack Ukraine. So this is how these two storylines are coming together. But the cooperation between Russia and and Iran has been going on for some time. But this will be a topic in the Oval Office when Zelensky meets with President Trump. Totally different dynamic than that infamous meeting about 18 months ago. Now Ukraine arguably has the upper hand. There's a sanctions bill pending still in the Senate, and Zelensky's coming with some cards. And he's saying he's going to lay out for the president his information on what Russia is doing to actually support Iran in its conflict against us. So this is how these two strands come together. The cooperation between Russia, Iran, and China is a larger backdrop to everything we're talking about day by day here, Kate. And that'll be a very important meeting in the Oval Office this week.
All right, thank you, Kate. This morning, global oil prices are falling sharply as U.S. and Iran have so far paused strikes for the third day in a row. No strikes from either side after nearly 2 straight weeks of nightly bombing. And this comes as U.S. officials, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, are warning about the dwindling supply of U.S. air defense munitions. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations also weighing in, saying President Trump is giving diplomatic efforts a chance.
What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level.
CNN's Zach Cohen is joining me now. Zach, he also said, that the U.S. ambassador to the UN, that the troops have all they need when it comes to this fight with Iran. But we're hearing about these dwindling munitions. What's the sense of what's going on here, Zach?
Yes, Sarah. Ambassador Waltz did say that the U.S. has all the munitions it needs, but that does not line up with what we've been reporting, frankly, since back in April, when analysts and Pentagon data has shown that the Pentagon's munition stockpile, including these key missile defense systems, are running low because of the high frequency with which they're being used during this war with Iran. And while the White House and the Trump administration is arguing that this temporary pause over the last 3 days is intended to give space for diplomacy, we've learned new details about a consequential meeting that took place at the White House on Friday when discussions were being had about potentially escalating the conflict with Iran. All of the president's top advisors were in the room, we're told, and there were some hard truths laid out for the president by both Vice President J.D. Vance and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, both of them warning about potential concerns related to the options for escalating this conflict. And Kane, in particular, pointed to these warnings about the U.S.'s diminishing stockpile of key munitions, saying that if the U.S. continues to use them at the clip that they've been using them so far in this conflict, they may not have enough for the next war, especially if it's against an adversary like China or Russia. Now, this is just one of the concerns, we're told, that was raised during this meeting on Friday that ultimately preceded the ongoing temporary pause. The other concerns that were raised included potentially massive amounts of civilian casualties inside Iran if the U.S. were to follow through with Trump's threat to strike civilian infrastructure, things like power plants and bridges, things of that nature. We're also told that concerns about retaliation against Gulf energy infrastructure and a broader regional escalation were also mentioned. So ultimately, those concerns all taken into account seem to have led to this current pause, but there's still so many questions about whether or not diplomacy can ultimately get back on track and bring an end to this war.
All right, now to new CNN reporting about a key White House meeting President Trump held on Friday focused on the U.S. war with Iran. A U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter tell CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned the president about potential consequences of escalating the war. The sources say Kane gave Trump his military options, but he also expressed concerns about further depletion of the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative consequences. A U.S. Defense Department source says military operations are currently on hold, but it's unclear if that Friday White House meeting prompted the U.S. to pause what had been nearly 2 weeks of strikes on Iran. CNN's Betsy Klein is joining us right now. Betsy, what more can you tell us about this meeting and the president's plans for the war going forward?
Frederica, President Trump spending part of his Friday with top advisors and cabinet officials discussing the possibility of escalating this war with Iran. But now we are seeing an apparent pause in that fighting after 13 consecutive nights of strikes. One U.S. official saying that military operations are on a hold as we are seeing these diplomatic discussions pick back up after that ceasefire fell apart just a few weeks ago. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz addressing that pause earlier today. Listen.
I've spoken with Secretary Hegseth. What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels, of course, within both the Iranian government and the U.S. government.
Now, in that Friday White House meeting, we are learning, according to our sources, that Vice President J.D. Vance, along with Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, both raised concerns about escalating this conflict. The president in the past has threatened massive attacks. That could include critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, Karg Island, which is a key oil hub, along with Pickaxe Mountain, which is believed to be a nuclear site. Now, that could constitute war crimes, potentially. And Kane, in that meeting, specifically raised concerns about U.S. munitions stockpiles. We've heard now from Pentagon spokesperson Sean Parnell. He says in a statement, quote, "We have executed multiple successful operations across combatant commands while ensuring the U.S. military possesses a deep arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our interests." Now, sources say that other major concerns were raised to the president in that meeting. That includes the possibility of massive civilian casualties in Iran, as well as a potential refugee crisis, as well as this idea that this could spill into a broader regional conflict. But there are few people within President Trump's inner circle that believe that these options for escalation are going to yield the results that President Trump is hoping for. Frederica.
All right, Betsy Klein, keep us posted there from the White House. Thank you. All right, meantime, Iran says it held talks with Oman in Tehran about the Strait of Hormuz over the past 2 days. The U.S. military has continued its naval blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command posted on social media yesterday that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated the blockade. At the same time, a new front in the war is opening in the Red Sea, where Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen have exchanged attacks with Saudi Arabia. That conflict threatening another critical oil corridor. CNN's Nick Robertson joins us right now. Nick, we've got this apparent U.S. pause on strikes in Iran. How might that impact peace talks overall?
It gives them an opportunity. We heard from the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman today saying that there was progress, that the talks were constructive, that they'd continue at a political and technical level. But it's key to understanding the details, and we just don't have them. The talks were all about the Strait of Hormuz, of course, and the key point here is, do the Iranians finally agree that they give up control of the Strait of Hormuz and allow traffic to pass through, marine traffic, and not try to get any tolls and not tell them which passages and pathways to go down through the Strait of Hormuz? And there's no indication that's about to happen. So it will be the output of that meeting, what the Omanis pass on to the U.S. diplomats, what the White House gets back from those talks is going to determine the next moves. Clearly, the implication we've heard from Ambassador Waltz, from the Pentagon, from the indications from the White House, is this is a sort of unannounced temporary ceasefire type deal to make the space for diplomacy. But it's not clear just because you're talking that there's actually going to be an outcome that's good enough for the White House. I think on the Houthi front in the Red Sea and trying to stop the Saudi oil getting out to world markets, it's having a chilling effect. But as far as we know today, the Houthis haven't fired any additional missiles at Saudi infrastructure. So perhaps, you know, they're aligned with Iran, so perhaps they're taking a beat on all of this at the moment as well. And then, of course, tomorrow, Prime Minister Netanyahu will leave Israel. He'll head to the United States for the funeral of Lindsey Graham. but it also is meeting at the White House with President Trump on Tuesday. We can expect the Israeli Prime Minister to thank the president for announcing that Saudi Arabia has to normalize with Israel before it can have this civilian nuclear deal. But also the key thing there will be what intelligence does Prime Minister Netanyahu share with President Trump about Iranian nuclear assets. Where are they? Of course, it was the Israelis that had a lot of information about leading towards the Pickaxe Mountain as being a storage facility for some of the highly enriched uranium and other nuclear storage sites that the Iranians have. So what else is Prime Minister Netanyahu going to put on President Trump's desk that then may influence where this war goes next?
All right, very complex. Nick Robertson, thank you so much. All right, let's continue this conversation. With us now is Ali Reza Nader. He is the president of the Nader Research Group. There is a pause in fighting right now, and Iran is talking with Omanis about the Strait of Hormuz. But I wonder, in your view, what kind of diplomacy talks continue? And with whom? I mean, we heard Mr. Waltz say that even the U.S. at the highest levels is still continuing to be part of the diplomacy talks. But I wonder, with this hold on U.S. military operations, what kind of impact these talks might have?
Thanks for having me. I think both sides really want this conflict to end. The Trump administration realizes that it is stuck in a quagmire, and the economy in Iran is suffering greatly. The regime is under huge pressure, and it wants to get the most out of its discussions with Washington, D.C. So I think the last few days of military action we've seen from the United States and from Iran is really meant to increase each side's leverage so they can get a better deal out of these upcoming negotiations. Oman has been a mediator between the two sides. It has very good relations with Iran, and will continue to play a big role, I think, in future negotiations.
And then you have stated that, U.S. attacks on civilian infrastructure inside Iran is actually strengthening the regime. Why do you believe that is the case? How do you know that is the case?
Look, before this war started in January, there were huge peaceful protests against the regime, really a revolutionary movement in Iran that was disrupted by this war. Right now, the U.S. is conducting lots of attacks against military facilities in Iran, but civilians are getting hit very hard as well. I'm very concerned about the U.S.-Israeli strategy of destroying Iran's critical water and energy infrastructure because Iran is on the brink of economic and environmental collapse. And the U.S. destroying these facilities is not going to hurt the regime. It's going to hurt ordinary people. Most of the regime's military assets and its senior leadership and Iran's political leadership is underground. They're pretty safe from these bombs, but the people above ground are getting hurt and killed.
How do you think specifically civilians in Iran are being impacted? Because obviously, pictures are not coming out, nor is the sentiment of a lot of Iranian civilians. So, can you paint a picture for us, of how life in general is being impacted there in Tehran and in the outskirts as well?
I think life in Iran is hell. Unless you're connected to the regime, life is hell because the people in Iran, and we hear this a lot from the reporting we're getting from within Iran, a lot of people expected that the Trump administration would come to their help after thousands of Iranians were massacred by the regime. That help really never came. The regime is still in power. It is executing innocent people left and right. And this war has demonstrated, I think, the weakness of U.S. military power. And I hope really for once and all, American policymakers and the public realize that you can't overthrow the regime in Iran through war, through bombs from the air. The people of Iran have to create that change for themselves, and they can't do that while they're being bombed.
Right, we begin this hour with new developments in the U.S. war with Iran. Today, a U.S. source tells CNN that military operations with Iran are currently on a hold. And it comes as we are learning new details about a key White House meeting President Trump held on Friday focused on the war. A U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter tells CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned the president about potential consequences of escalating the war. The sources say Kane gave Trump his military options, but he also expressed concerns about further depletion of the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative consequences of ramping up the war. Since that meeting, the U.S. has paused nearly 2 weeks of strikes on Iran, but it's unclear if those warnings prompted the lull in the attacks. We've got a team of correspondents around the globe covering these developments. Nick Robertson is in Jerusalem, but let's begin with Betsy Klein at the White House. Betsy, what more can you tell us about this White House meeting?
That's right, Frederica. President Trump spending part of his Friday huddling with top advisors and cabinet officials to discuss the options for an escalation in this 5-month-long war with Iran. But for the last 2 nights, we have seen this apparent pause in fighting after 13 consecutive days of U.S. strikes on Iran. One U.S. source telling CNN that those attacks are on a hold as they give the diplomatic discussions some time to play out. We heard moments ago from U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, weighing in on that pause. Listen.
I've spoken with Secretary Hegseth. What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels, of course, within both the Iranian government and the U.S. government.
Now, in that Friday meeting, we are learning that both Vice President J.D. Vance and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane raised concerns to the president about the possibility of that escalation. The president, for weeks, has been threatening massive attacks on Iran. That could impact critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, as well as the key oil hub of Karg Island. The president has been warned that that could constitute war crimes. Kane also specifically raised concerns about U.S. munitions stockpiles, but we heard from Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell addressing that. He says, quote, "We have executed multiple successful operations across combatant commands while ensuring the U.S. military possesses a deep arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our interests." But sources say that other concerns were raised to Trump, including the possibility of massive civilian casualties across Iran, the idea of a potential refugee crisis, as well as this conflict potentially spilling into a broader war across the Middle East. Now, there are few people, we are learning, within the president's inner circle who believe that the options he has been given for this escalation would yield the results that he is hoping for, Frederica, as he weighs that path forward.
All right, Betsy Klein at the White House, thanks so much. All right, let's go to Nick Robertson now. Nick, do we know how this apparent U.S. pause on strikes with Iran may be impacting peace talks?
Yeah, it's certainly given them the space. So the Omanis had a delegation in Tehran on Friday. They stayed there through Saturday. They left late Saturday. They were talking about the Strait of Hormuz. We heard today from the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman who said the talks were constructive, that progress was made, that they would continue at a technical and political level. So you can hear right there that the language kind of matches what we're getting from the White House. But the key details we're not getting right. And the key detail is, have the Iranians agreed not to try to charge tolls on the Strait of Hormuz, which is the main issue in play right now. Both countries have got their blockades ongoing at the moment, but the main hostilities are sort of abated. Perhaps President Trump will get more insights from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he leaves here tomorrow, heads to Washington for the funeral of Lindsey Graham, but he'll meet President Trump at the White House on Tuesday. he's very likely to give the president an update on the latest intelligence that the Israelis have. And of course, they've had intelligence that's pointed towards Pickaxe Mountain in Iran as a site where Iran may have tried to secure some of its highly enriched uranium and other centrifuges and other equipment that it uses to enrich uranium. So there may well be new information put in front of the president by the Israeli Prime Minister, who is keen, perhaps, let's not say for the war to continue, but the war pausing the way it has caused him political hardship at home. And he's got elections coming up in 3 months, so he'll be minded to try to find a way to persuade President Trump that there is still work to be done on Iran and perhaps present a roadmap for that. He'll also likely thank President Trump for putting a sort of a speed bump in the path over Saudi Arabia's civilian nuclear deal with the United States by saying that Saudi must normalize with Israel before that can go ahead. That's something the Israeli Prime Minister is grateful for. Big picture, did those talks give the product the president wants? That's the space we're in right now.
This morning, CNN has new reporting about a key meeting related to the U.S. war with Iran. A source and U.S. officials say that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned President Trump about potential consequences if he escalates the war. According to those sources, Kane expressed concerns about further depleting the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative effects. Now, it's unclear if that's why the U.S. decided to suspend nearly 2 weeks of attacks against Iran. The U.S. military has continued its naval blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command posted on social media yesterday that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated that blockade. CNN international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson is with us now. Nick, it's all happening ahead of that meeting between President Trump, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, their first since the start face-to-face in this war.
Yeah, and it's going to be an important one because Prime Minister Netanyahu has not been happy with the ceasefire that was put in place several months ago, and it's not clear where he stands on the current pause that's underway at the moment. He was speaking to the government this morning. He said that he'd be leaving for Washington tomorrow and that he would be meeting with President Trump on Tuesday, that all pending issues were going to be discussed, including Iran. So I think everyone here imagines that's pretty much going to be front and center. We've watched Omani diplomacy over the last couple of days. They took a trip, sent a delegation to Tehran. They got there Friday, left Saturday. The conversation was about the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, what the United States wants to see is Iran relinquish its desire and commitment to having some kind of payment method, some kind of continued control over ships coming and going from the Strait of Hormuz. It's not clear if the Omanis made any headway there, but it perhaps was this sort of pause has allowed that diplomacy to happen. So the question is, how will the president view the outcome of the conversations the Omanis had? But as you say, the United States continuing its blockade, the Iranians doing the same, saying that they've stopped 6 ships from going into the Strait of Hormuz, not by fire, but they're saying those ships have been now put at anchor. But the U.S. Central Command saying that they have told 12 ships and stopped 12 ships from passing through the Strait of Hormuz over the last few days during the current bout of conflict. So where it goes from here, this really does seem to be a matter of whether diplomacy has been able to take advantage of this pause.
Developments in the war with Iran. Today, a U.S. source tells CNN military operations with Iran are currently on a hold. That pause comes as we are learning new details about a key White House meeting President Trump held on Friday focused on the war. A U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter tells CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned the president about potential consequences of escalating the conflict. The sources say Kane gave Trump his military options. But he also expressed concerns about further depletion of the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative implications of ramping up the war. CNN's Betsy Klein is joining us right now from the White House. Betsy, what more can you tell us about this meeting?
Right, Frederica, this could go down as one of the more consequential meetings of this 5-month-long conflict with Iran now. But President Trump huddling with top advisors and cabinet officials on Friday to discuss options for an escalation in this war with Iran. But after that meeting, 2 consecutive nights without strikes after 13 days of attacks. Now, one U.S. source says that military operations are on a hold as they give the diplomatic discussions some time to play out. We heard earlier today from U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, addressing that pause. Listen.
I've spoken with Secretary Hegseth. What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels, of course, within both the Iranian government and the U.S. government.
Now, in that Friday meeting, 2 sources say that both Vice President J.D. Vance and U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane raised concerns about the possibility of an escalation. And we've heard President Trump telegraph the possibility of massive attacks for weeks now. That could be attacks on critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, as well as that key oil hub of Karg Island. And doing so, some have warned, could constitute war crimes. But one of the other concerns that Kane raised during that meeting, according to one of the sources, was the U.S. munitions stockpile. We heard from Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell. He says in a statement, quote, "We have executed multiple successful operations across combatant commands while ensuring the U.S. military possesses a deep arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our interests." Now, sources say that in that same meeting, other concerns were raised to the president, including the possibility of massive civilian casualties in Iran, the concerns about a refugee crisis potentially, as well as this conflict spilling into a broader regional conflict. Now, there are few people at this point in the president's inner circle that believe that the escalation options the president has been presented are going to yield the results that he is hoping for. So he's plotting a path forward with all this information. We'll wait to see what happens tonight, Frederica.
Israeli forces used tear gas and arrested dozens of Palestinians. This was in the occupied West Bank on Saturday. This is video from the village of Tel, where just a day earlier, clashes left 4 Palestinians and 2 Israeli soldiers dead. On the orders of the Prime Minister, the Israeli military began preparing for a large-scale operation, canceling leave and getting ready to send in reinforcements. A paramedic described how people in the village are feeling.
People here are scared of what happened yesterday, noting that around 8 houses were set on fire in the village, and vehicles as well. So people started taking precautions and buying fire extinguishers and first aid kits to be able to tend to the incidents until the needed services and paramedics arrive.
But some Israelis are coming together to condemn settler assaults on Palestinians in the West Bank. Here's a look at Tel Aviv on Saturday, filled with people chanting and carrying eye-catching signs. The deadly incident Friday in the West Bank came amid a marked escalation in settler attacks in the territory. The UN has called for urgent action to stop the violence. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to visit the U.S. this week. He's going to meet with President Trump at the White House on Tuesday. While he's in the U.S., Mr. Netanyahu is also expected to attend the funeral for the late Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. This is the Prime Minister's 7th visit to the U.S. to meet with the president and comes, of course, at President Trump's invitation. Joining me now from Jerusalem is Yaakov Katz. He is the co-founder of the Middle East America Dialogue, an author and a senior columnist, at the Jerusalem Post. Thank you so much for joining us, first of all, Yaakov. I want to talk, of course, about this visit that will take place on Tuesday. And we know Iran's going to be at the top of the agenda. We know as well that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been opposed to negotiations. So let's get into the details here. What plans, ideas, alternatives is he going to pitch to President Trump on the Tehran front? How is he going to try to shape Washington's next move here?
Well, I think that in Israel, there's a feeling of, Salma, of like a bad taste, the way that the war has been going and the way it ended with that MOU in the middle of June that didn't really pan out because, as we've seen, except for the last 2 days, almost 2 weeks of every single day airstrikes by the Americans against Iran, which is refusing to capitulate and basically give in to what Trump's basic demands have been, to give up the nuclear program, to open the Strait of Hormuz, and to stop the continued buildup of their military capabilities. Israel would like to see more strikes, more extensive, to include more targets. And I think that that's what Netanyahu is coming to Washington, is to discuss with Trump, okay, what are these next steps going to be? How do we make sure that a bad deal is potentially not reached? But at the same time, Salma, we have to keep in mind, Netanyahu is very sensitive and aware of the fact that there is a growing voice or sounds within Washington, especially within the Republican Party, that it was him and it was Israel that dragged the United States and Donald Trump specifically into this war. He doesn't want to be seen as doing that again. So he's going to have to balance both of these interests very carefully. On the one hand, try to get out of Trump what he can on Iran. On the other hand, not be seen as, again, the guy who's the warmonger who's dragging America into what has already been called a forever war.
So let's delve into that further, because this is the crux of the issue here, right? Is this up and down relationship between Netanyahu and Trump over the last few months. Give me a current state of play, if you will, of their relationship. Does he really have President Trump's ear at this moment, or is he going to be unheard, as you said, because of these criticisms in Washington?
Well, I mean, that's a real good question, because what we've looked and we've seen over the last few weeks is that there is a strain in the relationship. It's no secret. I mean, just listen to Vice President J.D. Vance's comments in that podcast interview with Joe Rogan, things that he said about a campaign, this alleged campaign that the Israeli government has launched in America against him specifically and on the administration to pressure them to continue the war. We've seen how President Trump has met with President Erdogan of Turkey, a known critic, and very hostile relations between Netanyahu and Erdogan. He's met with the Iraqi prime minister. He's met with the Lebanese president. Netanyahu has been trying to get a meeting with Trump for several weeks and hasn't succeeded. Now he's been able to connect that with the funeral of the late Senator Lindsey Graham that's supposed to also take place on Tuesday. So he's able to combine between the two. But Israel has been, and you can see this, it's quite apparent, has been pushed aside from the point in the beginning few weeks of the war. Joint planning, joint deliberations, joint strategy. Now it's as if Israel's not even in the room. So Netanyahu wants to try to get back in that room, not only, but also back at a chair at the table in making those decisions. Will Trump give him that? I mean, it will depend on what mood the president's in, on what the atmosphere is like, and basically also what Israel's bringing on its own and what it can bring as an advantage to the next steps on Iran.
So let's talk about that, because like you said, Netanyahu wants to be back in that room. These men, both Netanyahu and Trump, are all about the art of the deal. What concessions or sweeteners may be offered? Because we know that President Trump is losing patience on Gaza. He's losing patience on Lebanon. He's losing patience on Iran. Is there a deal here that Prime Minister Netanyahu could offer, or a concession to ease that?
Well, I mean, he's also probably, I'm guessing that President Trump is also watching what's happening in the West Bank, as you reported just a few minutes ago, and seeing also how there's increasing violence there. And he's not going to be happy with that situation either. So there's a lot of multiple fronts that Israel continues to find itself in without really a resolution on any of them. I mean, in Lebanon, it's probably the most optimistic. We have this pilot program that the Israeli Defense Forces are moving out of southern Lebanese villages, and the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, is moving in and to fill the void and hopefully prevent Hezbollah from returning. But you're right, Gaza's stuck. West Bank, there's no political horizon. And Iran, it doesn't seem like anything's moving forward. I think that what Trump might want out of Netanyahu, unless they're about to go again towards a joint offensive against the Iranians, is sit tight, let me reach a political resolution, and don't ruin it for me. There were those voices that we heard in the immediate aftermath of the MOU in June, that because of the continued violence between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, which I think was completely legitimate on Israel's part, it has to defend itself, but still perception was that whenever Israel defended itself in the north and attacked in Lebanon, the Iranians used that as an excuse not to agree to an agreement with the Americans. So Trump might want Netanyahu, he'll say, Bibi, just sit tight. Let me get this agreement. Don't get in the way. Can Netanyahu be seen as doing that with the elections on the horizon? Let's remember, Salma, Israel has its own elections, October 27th. Netanyahu needs to be seen as standing firm, standing tough, standing up to whatever some other foreign leader tells him to do. He can't give in that easily.
This morning on the U.S. war in Iran. It involves a key meeting that President Trump had on Friday. Now, a source and U.S. official tell CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane came to warn President Trump at a meeting about escalating the war. The sources say that Kane told Trump his military options, but he also expressed concerns about further depleting the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative consequences. Now, it's unclear if those reasons prompted the U.S. to pause what had been nearly 2 consecutive weeks of strikes on Iran. The U.S. military has continued its naval blockade, though, of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command posted on social media yesterday that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated that blockade. Let's go now to CNN International diplomatic editor Nick Robertson. What is the Trump administration saying about the concerns of escalation ahead of this meeting with Netanyahu on Tuesday?
Yeah, the concern is, this is something that analysts CNN have spoken to as well, have said the defensive missile systems like the THAAD, the Patriot, a lot of them were used up defending against all those incoming Iranian missiles in the earlier part of the war a few months ago. So that's a concern. Significant number of Tomahawks also, an attack, land attack weapon, also used up. So if you commit more weapon systems to another round of fighting, then you reduce your options for another war or another conflict in another theater around the world. That was, as from what we understand, was the concern raised. What it has allowed, this pause, whatever the reason, and diplomats I'm talking to are sort of referring to this as an unannounced ceasefire, if you will, that's now gone through 2 nights. It's given an opportunity for an Omani delegation to go to Tehran. They went Friday, stayed into Saturday, left late Saturday to have conversations. The Iranian foreign minister saying that there was progress in those talks, that they focused on the Strait of Hormuz. But there's absolutely no indication here whatsoever that the Iranians have given ground on their core point on the Strait of Hormuz, which is they want to have control over it and be able to make money out of it in the future. The Iranians also have spoken about how they've caused a number of vessels, 6 vessels, to go to anchor and not transit the Strait of Hormuz. I think when you step back just a tiny little bit and look at the messaging from both the U.S. side and the Iranian side, both operating their blockades, but not signaling it through maximalist shooting of ships, but sort of a one tempo down, if you will, the boarding and inspection and the ships being put at anchor. Can this pause for diplomacy hold? And as discussed here, the cost of an escalation, there are implications with that, and that was what was explained to the president.
A new round of tariffs just kicked in on almost every single U.S. import. Here's why. The U.S. claims that 60 of its trading partners are using forced labor to produce goods exported to the U.S. These tariffs hit Friday just after another similar tariff expired. So while it won't hit your wallet too much, rising gas prices will. We'll talk about that, of course. All the factors that have prevented oil from surging recently are either weaker or gone. I'm joined now by Washington correspondent for Yahoo Finance, Ben Worskell. Ben, welcome back to the show. Let's start with the tariffs. The tariffs have been unpopular here across the U.S. since so-called Liberation Day. While these tariffs are not nearly as high as the ones implemented that were shut down by the Supreme Court, you've got reporting about the impact and how much it's really going to affect the imports coming in from around the world.
Yeah, good to be with you. These tariffs are, as you mentioned, these tariffs are kind of a changeover of sorts to new tariff authorities that aren't going to have a lot of impacts immediately. But there is a lot of evidence here that what Trump is trying to do is set up more tariffs down the road as he goes forward. The main headline this week was a switch up of tariffs from 10% tariffs that expired on Friday at midnight to new tariffs of 10 to 12.5% that came into effect at 12:01. So just 1 minute minute later on this issue of forced labor you mentioned here. This doesn't change the tariff rate, but it does create a more legally durable option that the White House thinks they can build on. We're expecting more investigations there in the months ahead that could raise these rates, even as they don't change now. Another important strand on tariffs to watch this week is Trump's announcement on Canada. He talked about 50% tariffs on Canada that could be in effect by August on some goods. This again has sort of limited immediate effects. It's only impacts about 5% of U.S. imports, but this is a new tariff authority that we haven't seen from Trump before. He's reaching all the way back to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 for this. This is a much more quick acting option that has a lot of legal problems. The question whether this stands up in court is a big one, but the sense I get from listening to the administration and talking to trade officials is that they're trying to see if this will stick, if this will stand up in court, and if Trump can do this, we could see a lot more from that in the months ahead. But the bottom line, as you mentioned, tariff rates began this week at about 11%. They're still at 11%. They're just trying to push it up higher to these kind of pre-liberation or these Liberation Day rates.
We'll see if there's any retaliation. Of course, we saw that, excuse me, in 2025 from Canada, China, other countries as well. Let's talk about oil prices above $100 a barrel on Thursday for the first time since May. This morning, as we've reported, $4.11 per gallon for regular nationally on average. When you add in the Houthis' attacks on vessels passing through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, in addition to what's happening at the Strait of Hormuz, how does that change the prospect for the next several weeks or months of this war and the price of oil?
Absolutely. No, it really creates a real level of uncertainty in the energy sector that is really notable. A third factor I'll add for you is the war in Ukraine. That is a underappreciated aspect of this with Russian refineries being bombarded here. So this is essentially a perfect storm for the energy sector and has seen crude oil prices up 20% over the last month. And as you mentioned, prices at the pump, $4.11. One important, I think, conversation amongst the sector is how things aren't worse on this. $4.11 price, I don't want to downplay $4.11 a gallon gas. That's lower than it was earlier in the war, and it's lower than it was $5 a gallon gas just a few years back. This comes as the energy sector has talked about how things could get worse in a hurry here if inventory levels continue to drop as they're going forward. But there's also been predictions since February, since this war in Iran began, of much more dire consequences here than what we're seeing at the moment. Again, a $100 a gallon for crude oil and $4.11 gas is significant, but there's a lot of folks out there that are thinking the inventory levels and things like demand could pick up in the weeks ahead and push things even worse. Bottom line here for oil markets is no one really knows what's going to happen, and we've had predictions for months now that have been mixed on this front, but we are seeing pressure on a lot of different fronts from around the globe.
Speaking of predictions, and I got 30 seconds for you here, Ben, we got a Fed meeting coming up midweek. What's the expectation on rates?
Yeah, all eyes will be on the Federal Reserve. The expectation is that rates will be steady, but we're going to have a real conversation at the Fed about all these different factors. Oil prices are a major one. The new chairman, Kevin Warsh, has sort of taken the Fed out of the business of offering forward guidance here, but they are expecting to keep rates steady. The question is when they have to step in on rates. For right now, lower inflation readings for June means the Fed probably holds steady, but they're likely to raise this fall is what the expectation is.
This morning, CNN has new reporting about a key meeting related to the U.S. war with Iran. A source and U.S. officials say that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned President Trump about potential consequences if he escalates the war. According to those sources, Kane expressed concerns about further depleting the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative effects. Now, it's unclear if that's why the U.S. decided to suspend nearly 2 weeks of attacks against Iran. The U.S. military has continued its naval blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command posted on social media yesterday that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated that blockade. CNN international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson is with us now. Nick, it's all happening ahead of that meeting between President Trump, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, their first since the start face-to-face in this war.
Yeah, and it's going to be an important one because Prime Minister Netanyahu has not been happy with the ceasefire that was put in place several months ago, and it's not clear where he stands on the current pause that's underway at the moment. He was speaking to the government this morning. He said that he'd be leaving for Washington tomorrow and that he would be meeting with President Trump on Tuesday, that all pending issues were going to be discussed, including Iran. So I think everyone here imagines that's pretty much going to be front and center. We've watched Omani diplomacy over the last couple of days. They took a trip, sent a delegation to Tehran. They got there Friday, left Saturday. The conversation was about the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, what the United States wants to see is Iran relinquish its desire and commitment to having some kind of payment method, some kind of continued control over ships coming and going from the Strait of Hormuz. It's not clear if the Omanis made any headway there, but it perhaps was this sort of pause has allowed that diplomacy to happen. So the question is, how will the president view the outcome of the conversations the Omanis had? But as you say, the United States continuing its blockade, the Iranians doing the same, saying that they've stopped 6 ships from going into the Strait of Hormuz, not by fire, but they're saying those ships have been now put at anchor. But the U.S. Central Command saying that they have told 12 ships and stopped 12 ships from passing through the Strait of Hormuz over the last few days during the current bout of conflict. So where it goes from here, this really does seem to be a matter of whether diplomacy has been able to take advantage of this pause.
Concerns of the Iran war widening with a new front emerging in the Red Sea. Video showing smoke rising near an oil facility in Saudi Arabia, which the Houthis claim to have hit on Saturday. The Iranian-backed rebel group in Yemen says it carried out 2 military operations using dozens of missiles and drones. And it comes a day after Saudi Arabia launched strikes in retaliation for Houthi attacks on commercial ships.
We reaffirm that the maritime blockade imposed on the Saudi enemy remains in force in response to its aggression and unjust blockade, which has continued for 12 years. We will not hesitate to expand our military movements and escalate our actions in the coming hours and days, in line with our policy of blockade for blockade and escalation for escalation.
The U.S. military is enforcing its blockade of Iranian ports. It says U.S. forces boarded a tanker on the Arabian Sea Saturday to verify it was in compliance before allowing it to continue its journey. Since reimposing the blockade earlier this month, the U.S. military has redirected 12 commercial ships and disabled 2 others that didn't comply with the blockade. For more, let's bring in Nega Anga. She is a visiting fellow at King's College London and former senior advisor at the U.S. State Department and National Security Council under the Biden administration. Nega, thank you so much for your time. Let's start with the Houthis ramping up aggression. And you heard the translation of the spokesperson there, threatening a blockade of another waterway. What do you make of this escalation for escalation declaration?
Right. Well, hello. Thanks for having me. Look, I think where we are right now, the paradox is that the central front between the U.S. And the Iranians in the Strait of Hormuz is sort of cooling right now. The conflict is spreading geographically. So when we think about this, the Houthis are essentially trying to do at Bab al-Mandab what the Iranians did in the Strait of Hormuz. So they're essentially turning this geography into some sort of political and economic leverage. And so they're threatening Saudi tankers, their energy infrastructures. They're also showing that any regional security arrangement needs to account for the Houthis as well. So they're essentially, in many ways aligned with Iran. They benefit from Iranian support, but they do have their own, leadership, their own domestic ambitions, their own appetite for risk. And so this is actually a very concerning sort of shift in where we are in the conflict in the Middle East, because again, there's only so much that the Iranians can also control Houthi action. And so this could escalate quite quickly.
Nega, let's turn to Iran itself. And we find ourselves on air without a bombing strike campaign carried out by the U.S. today on Iran. A pause after more than 2 weeks. We also now have, according to a U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter, reporting that Vice President J.D. Vance and General Dan Kane both raised to President Trump concerns about escalating the war, including concerns about the U.S. munitions stockpile. Now, we do want to be clear that it's unclear if the munitions concern was a deciding factor in operations being on hold, but is that too large of a leap to think it may have been?
It could be a possibility, but again, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric that is being passed around. It could be in reaction to Congress's actions. It could be in reaction to, trying to deliver some sort of indirect messages to the Iranians or others. But, you know, what I could essentially say right now, it looks like Washington is just trying to cool the temperature, trying to enforce some form of de-escalation. I think they truly are testing as well reciprocity. They want to see if the pause in these strikes also mean that Tehran will also exercise some form of restraint. So I don't know necessarily if how much weight we can put behind it. You know, it is quite plausible, but at the same time, I think, you know, again, everyone is trying to find these diplomatic off-ramps, and this could be one of those scenarios.
And you really highlighted there just how complicated this all is, with so many different factors playing into it. I do know that this is not the first time that there's been concerns of munition stockpile being low for the United States military. Can you help us understand, for those without a military background, what that truly means, and what does that look like? What are the potential implications outside of Iran if the stockpile's low?
That's a great question. Again, we have to keep in mind, you know, the President of the United States, the Trump administration right now has to focus on the U.S.'s national security. So when we look at our national security, it's global. So the concerns are, you know, if we are expending all of our resources in a region, what does that mean if for whatever reason U.S., whether it's U.S. territories, U.S. friends and allies, are attacked in another part of the world? Again, you know, there are so many different central commands globally around the world. Again, there are concerns that the United States needs to have enough resources and assets if something were to occur near and close to the homeland or in the Pacific, and they need to be prepared for all scenarios.
The occupied West Bank, where Israeli forces used tear gas and arrested dozens of Palestinians on Saturday. It happened in the village of Tel, where just a day earlier, clashes left 4 Palestinians and 2 Israeli soldiers dead. On the orders of the prime minister, the Israeli military began preparing for a large-scale operation, canceling leave and getting ready to send in reinforcements. A paramedic described how people in the village are feeling.
People here are scared of what happened yesterday, noting that around 8 houses were set on fire in the village, and vehicles as well. So people started taking precautions and buying fire extinguishers and first aid kits to be able to tend to the incidents until the needed services and paramedics arrive.
But some Israelis are coming together to condemn settler assaults on Palestinians in the West Bank. Here's a look at Tel Aviv on Saturday, for example, filled with people chanting and carrying eye-catching signs. The deadly Friday incident in the West Bank, it came amid a marked escalation in settler attacks in the territory. The UN has called for urgent action to stop the violence. And now to concerns of the Iran war widening, with a new front emerging in the Red Sea. Iranian-backed Houthis are claiming responsibility for a new wave of attacks against Saudi Arabia. And it comes a day after Saudi Arabia launched strikes in retaliation for Houthi attacks on commercial ships. CNN's Nick Robertson has more.
Yeah, the significance is it's another route for Saudi oil that's trying to get to the international markets down the Red Sea. About 5-7% of the energy needs, particularly of Asia, passes down the Red Sea, particularly now as the Strait of Hormuz is closed. So the fact that the Houthis have said they're putting a blockade on it for Saudi tankers with Saudi oil on board, and they've hit a couple, then the Saudis struck their port of Hodeidah last night. Then this morning, the Houthis upped the ante again, hitting not just ships in the Red Sea, but actually Saudi energy facilities on land. The port city of Jazan, the Houthis claimed that they targeted Aramco energy facilities there, and in Yambo, further north, a key vital point in Saudi's oil distribution network, because that's the hub of where the pipeline that comes all the way across Saudi Arabia gets to export the oil on the Red Sea. Now, sirens did go off. The air defense system in Yambo was put on alert, but no signs of impact there. But around Jazan, a lot of black smoke was seen coming up. So this is a dynamic where the Saudis really have made a lot of preparations already for the possibility of not just continued strikes against the Houthis, but the potential for ground forces, ground operations against the Houthis. That's all sort of up in the air at the moment, let's say. We don't know if it's going to escalate or how it's going to play out. Looking across at the Strait of Hormuz and the US-Iran dynamic, I think it's significant. There are a couple of things that have happened. The Omanis have sent a negotiating delegation to Tehran. They're not sort of official mediators in this at the moment, but they have been in the past. So they sent a delegation to Tehran. The Qataris have told their shipping that it'll be free to travel tomorrow out through wherever it wants to go, providing it normally takes proper safety protocols. This does seem to signal that there is some hope in the region at the moment, and certainly that's my understanding, that the diplomats who are close to the process, who are looking at what happens tonight, and if there is no exchange of fire between the US and Iran tonight, then they'll be feeling that this is some kind of unofficial, if you will, behind the scenes type ceasefire deal. So I think there's some hope in the region that if tonight is quiet, then perhaps we're entering a new phase or a new step in the current phase at least. But it really is very difficult to say which way it will go.
And now to the Middle East, where the war with Iran may be spreading beyond the Gulf. Video shows smoke rising near an oil facility along Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coast, which the Houthis claimed to have hit on Saturday. The Iranian-backed rebel group in Yemen says it carried out 2 military operations using dozens of missiles and drones. This all comes a day after Saudi Arabia launched strikes in retaliation for Houthi attacks on commercial ships.
We reaffirm that the maritime blockade imposed on the Saudi enemy remains in force in response to its aggression and unjust blockade, which has continued for 12 years. We will not hesitate to expand our military movements and escalate our actions in the coming hours and days, in line with our policy of blockade for blockade and escalation for escalation.
The U.S. military is enforcing its blockade of Iranian ports. It says U.S. forces boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea on Saturday to verify it was in compliance before allowing it to continue its journey. Since reimposing the blockade earlier this month, the U.S. military has redirected 12 commercial ships and disabled 2 others that didn't comply with the blockade. Well, Nabi Bulus, Middle East Bureau Chief for the Los Angeles Times, joins me now from Amman to discuss more. It's good to see you, sir. Can you just start by setting the scene for us? What's the mood like where you are right now?
Well, Jordan is a particularly interesting case right now because although it's not as prominent as the other Gulf countries in terms of the sheer number of attacks by Iran, it nevertheless has received its share, especially in the last 13 days. So if you consider that we've had, near nightly bombings of Iran, Jordan has been attacked on at least 9 separate occasions. And the targets have been U.S. facilities within Jordanian bases across the country. So as you can imagine, this has been it's quite a ramp up for Jordan, which is normally, I guess it's more quiet than other nations at this point. And so this has been an interesting time here. At the same time, the fact is the tension that you're feeling in the region is across the entire region at this point because of the sheer number of conflicts that are brewing all around. If you consider what's been happening in Yemen, if you consider what's been happening in Iran, of course, and of course in Jordan with the attacks and also in the West Bank, etc., and of course in Lebanon, it's been quite a trying time for leaders across the region.
As you mentioned, we did see U.S. service member deaths in Jordan just a few days ago. Tell me how significant that moment was within this conflict.
Well, it's worth noting that Jordan has been a loyal partner to the U.S. in terms of military and counterterrorism issues for decades now, right? I mean, if we're just considering the history of this, from Al-Qaeda to ISIS, etc., I mean, Jordan has really opened up its bases for Western troops to come in and conduct operations in the region. Now, and at the same time, Jordan has sought to downplay that with its like domestic population, because I mean, the fact is, with the U.S.'s support for Israel, etc., and of course Jordan's population being overwhelmingly pro-Palestinian, they've sought to downplay this. This has very much put it on the fore. The recent incidents have put this on the fore, and so Jordan's attitude right now is that it wants to continue keeping this on a low profile, and at the same time, it wants to also make sure that none of this happens again. Right? We are talking about, at this point, I believe 9 attacks on separate bases across the country, right, from the south to the north, and so Jordan is interested in not having this happen anymore. Now, whether it can do so is a separate matter, because at the same time, its role in the U.S.'s war on Iran is increasing. I mean, just in the last few days, we've been seeing these, these air bridges just going back and forth between like a number of bases in Jordan and from Europe and elsewhere. And this indicates a ramp up is coming in terms of combat operations.
Well, at the same time as that, the U.S. does appear to have paused fresh strikes while tightening maritime enforcement. Do you think that's a tactical pause or just a change in strategy?
I mean, it's worth noting that if we consider the MOU and what was been happening before, right, there has been talk that this was merely an attempt to replenish already depleted stockpiles of interceptors and ammunition and other logistical issues to be dealt with. So, I mean, I must say it does seem to be that, because there is no real impetus towards any kind of ceasefire or any kind of denouement for the conflict here. So, yes.
And as you look ahead to the next 24 hours, what do you think is the biggest thing that you're going to be watching for?
Well, at this point, the main issue is happening in Bab el-Mandeb on the Red Sea. Right. The fact is that if the Houthis do manage to reimpose a blockade of their own in that area, right, we are talking about a massive spike in energy prices immediately. And logistically, that will be a big problem for various countries in the region that have been actually reorienting their energy supplies away from the Strait of Hormuz towards the Red Sea. If that changes, we are talking about a big problem across the region, because, I mean, then you'll have countries like Jordan, Egypt, and others even more affected. And these countries do not have the same financial cushion, right, if you will, as the Gulf nations do. So we are looking at, I have to say, unfortunately, more trouble ahead.
Can you believe that so many months later, we're still talking about this?
Well, the fact is, this has been very much, I think, the policy of the administration since it took over, right? I mean, if you consider the various conflicts that it's been involved in here, right? None of these conflicts have been resolved in any meaningful way. I mean, yes, the administration talks about all these conflicts that they have stopped or resolved, but it's all on a low ebb. I mean, just look at Gaza, right? We've been talking about a ceasefire there for, a year at this point, roughly speaking. And I mean, the fact is there is no ceasefire. Consider Lebanon, same thing. We've had a ceasefire there that is not a ceasefire. We are, unfortunately, I think, in a new normal with this administration, where ceasefires don't really mean anything, where peacetime and war bleed into each other. And at the same time, there is no real resolution of any conflict. And that perhaps is the policy.
I want to take you to the Middle East now, where the U.S. military campaign against Iran is on hold. Now, that's according to a source with the Defense Department. We are also learning that Vice President J.D. Vance and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have both raised concerns about escalating the war with Iran. Now, it is not clear that is why the U.S. paused strikes after nearly 2 weeks of daily attacks, but the U.S. military does continue to enforce its blockade of Iranian ports. It says U.S. forces boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea on Saturday to verify it was in compliance before allowing it to continue its journey. Now, meanwhile, a new front is emerging in the Red Sea. Video shows smoke rising near an oil facility along Saudi Arabia's coast, which the Houthis claimed to have hit on Saturday. The Iranian-backed rebel group in Yemen says it carried out 2 military operations using dozens of missiles and drones. For more on all of this, I'm joined by Nick Robertson, live in Jerusalem. This is very interesting to me, Nick, this idea that Both the vice president and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff raised concerns about escalating the war any further with Iran. Do you know what those concerns are? And could they possibly explain this pause in airstrikes?
Yeah, analysts that CNN's been talking to talk about a diminution in the capability of air defenses, defending from incoming ballistic missiles, that in the early part of the war, the US spent more than half its inventory. This is an analysis, not figures coming from the Pentagon, but more than half of its THAAD, the high altitude interceptor missile, that it's spent close to half of its Patriot defensive missiles, and these can't be quickly replaced. They are being replaced. Production continues, but they're not immediately available. The Tomahawk, the cruise missile attack, about 30% of those used. So the analysis is that if you continue to double down and fire missiles at Iran, Iran sends their missiles back, they need to be intercepted. Then if you need to fight another war, wherever that may be, you're going to find yourself depleted. That's the sort of assessment. And we don't know exactly the words that Dan Kane used when briefing President Trump, but we do know that this is a broad concern within the industry. I think to get a better understanding of why we're seeing a pause at the moment, that some diplomats I'm talking to are sort of giving this as akin to an unannounced ceasefire. It seems to be to give breathing space for the talks that the Omani delegation had in Tehran on Friday and Saturday. And we've heard from the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson on that, saying that there was progress, that there will continue to be technical and political level talks about that. And the talks were focused on the Strait of Hormuz. So I think the understanding perhaps here is that there is a pause being given at the moment to allow talks to unravel both sides' positions on the Strait of Hormuz. We don't know if Iran continues to hold by its original position that it absolutely must be able to control the Strait and therefore make money out of it in the future. There's no reason to see that that has changed. And both sides very publicly, as you say, showing that their blockades are in place. The Iranian state media today saying that 6 ships have been forced to be put at anchor and not to try to transit the Strait. And I think, you know, if you look at the imaging and messaging from both sides, they're emphasizing not the kinetic side that we've seen both Iranians and the US use to stop ships in their tracks, to hit them militarily, but they're using the sort of inspection tactic. The ships going to anchor is the message coming from the Iranians. And again, that speaks to a sort of a just tamping down the escalating rhetoric and the escalating positions. So while the concerns exist over weapons, it does seem also that perhaps part of the reason that there's that concern exists, and therefore you need to talk, the space has been created for those talks.
Nick Robertson on what might be breathing space for diplomacy. Thank you so much. The U.S. military has officially confirmed the identity of a soldier killed during Iranian strikes in Jordan on July 17th. The Pentagon says New York. The Defense Department says she was known to her family as Sarah, was born in Trinidad and came to the U.S. as a toddler and was raised by a single mother. Where the U.S. military campaign against Iran is on hold. That's according to a source with the Defense Department. We're also learning that Vice President J.D. Vance and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have both raised concerns about escalating the war. Now, it's not clear if that is why the U.S. paused strikes after nearly 2 weeks of daily attacks. The U.S. military is, however, enforcing its blockade of Iranian ports. It says U.S. forces boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea Saturday to verify it was in compliance before allowing it to continue its journey. Meanwhile, a front is emerging in the Red Sea. Video shows smoke rising near an oil facility along Saudi Arabia's coast, which the Houthis claim to have hit on Saturday. The Iranian-backed rebel group in Yemen says it carried out 2 military operations using dozens of missiles and drones. We're joined now live by Nick Robertson. He is in Jerusalem. So we now have this 2-day pause in airstrikes, Nick. Do we have any indication of what that means? Because we have these contradicting messages from Washington. At times we're hearing that President Trump is weighing a massive attack, but also we're hearing today, of course, that the Vice President and the Joint Chiefs of Staff are warning against an escalation. Do you have any insight? Have you been speaking to your sources on this?
I think the best insight we have that there is, in fact, a sort of a de facto ceasefire in place, and that does seem to have been allow some level of diplomacy to happen. The Omanis had a delegation in Tehran on Friday and Saturday. They left late Saturday. We don't know what was precisely discussed, but it does seem to have focused on the Straits of Hormuz. At least that's according to the spokesman at the Foreign Ministry in Tehran. And he said that the talks were constructive and there was progress, but progress that the United States would like to see on the Strait of Hormuz would be Iran relinquishing its desired right to be able to extract a management system and financial benefit for controlling the Strait of Hormuz. That's the conundrum here. So while there's been this pause, which may be beneficial to the U.S. to pause before it makes the next move, because there are concerns. Joint Chief Staff Dan Kane laying that out to the president. We don't know precisely what was said again on that, but there's concern about munitions going forward. And from independent experts, we understand that is the defensive missile systems, the THAAD, the Patriot. They're in not short supply, but half of them have already been used. Stocks have been used in the first part of the war. So that's the concern. Again, we hear from the White House, President Trump prefers a diplomatic off-ramp. The pressure for getting that is greater if the weapon stocks are lower. So I think, there is rhetoric bouncing around, but the reality on the ground, I think, is perhaps what we should be guided by. And a second night without strikes indicates that some sort of ceasefire is in place, and the Qataris have told their shipping that they can, as of today, go back to sea again, taking the proper safety and security precautions. It's painting a better picture, but it's far from solved, of course.
We have more breaking news this evening. The U.S. military said it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea today as part of its blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command says that the naval blockade against Iran remains in full effect. Now, it all comes even as, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, neither the U.S. nor Iran seem to carry out serious attacks overnight. But the apparent pause in strikes does not mean the conflict is any less fraught, as a new front is emerging in the war, this time in the Red Sea. This morning, Iranian-backed rebel group the Houthis attacking Saudi Arabian targets on the coast. CNN senior White House reporter Betsy Klein joins us now. Betsy, what's the latest here?
Well, Danny, the short answer is we just don't know how much to read into what appears to be a pause in strikes in Iran. A relatively quiet night last night after 13 consecutive nights of U.S. launched strikes. But this comes after U.S. intelligence agencies had assessed in recent days that the types of limited strikes that the U.S. had been carrying out were unlikely to shift Iran's negotiation position. President Trump, in his view, does not believe that Iran is ready yet to come to the table and negotiate in a meaningful way. He also offered some view into his headspace yesterday. Listen.
Look, we're talking to them right now. I think they're getting more and more serious as the days go by, for maybe the obvious reason. But we are talking to them right now. Look, there are two ways. I consider that the smarter way, but the other is probably the easier way, doing what we're doing. And we can take that to a much higher level if we want to. We're prepared to do that, as you know. We're locked and loaded.
Now, just about 5 months into this war, the president has limited options. He can pursue that diplomatic path, which after that ceasefire and memorandum of understanding have totally broken down, have really proven to not yet be successful. He can maintain the status quo, these limited strikes, as I mentioned earlier, or he can escalate. The president has previewed the possibility of really ramping up with attacks on critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, Karg Island, that key oil hub, as well as the possibility of strikes on Pickaxe Mountain, which is believed to be an Iranian nuclear set. But as we are trying to ascertain what exactly to make of this apparent pause in strikes, a senior U.S. official telling me, quote, President Trump has always been clear that his preference is diplomacy, but he has shown Iran what will happen if they fail to come to the table in a serious way. The clear question right now is whether whether President Trump believes that that bar is being met for some serious diplomacy going forward. But this is clearly a moment of extreme political pressure on the president. Public opinion shows that this war is deeply unpopular with the American people. Gas prices ticking up to $4.11 a gallon, according to AAA on average. And the midterms are now just 3 months away. So all of that weighing on President Trump as he plots a path forward, Danny.
Yeah, weighing on the president indeed. All right, Betsy Klein, thank you so much for that reporting as always. Appreciate it. And we're joined now by retired U.S. Army Major General Randy Manner. He served as the Deputy Commanding General of the U.S. Third Army in Kuwait. General, good to have you here this evening. From a military perspective, what does it signal to you that there were no reported strikes from either side really overnight?
Well, it's always good that hopefully there's a de-escalation. That's always good for both sides. The other side of the coin is that is also a precursor to perhaps preparing for much larger strikes to come. So I think in addition to what was said by the previous reporter, it is very likely because the status quo attacks the United States has been doing have had minimal to no impact on shifting the Iranian position and getting them to the bargaining table.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because for almost 2 weeks straight, right, the U.S. conducted nightly strikes against Iran. What do you see, if anything, was achieved during that period? Because, I mean, I guess if it resulted in this de-escalation, that's one thing, but it doesn't seem like much came of that, no?
It was a complete waste of armaments, a complete waste of lives on both sides. And the result is that it's been verified and validated by the Iranians that our president, unfortunately, is a paper tiger. He threatens constantly, but the reality is he has been unsuccessful in bringing the Iranians to the table. Quite frankly, I think the president's desperate to get back to the day before he started this war, and he'd be very happy with having the Strait reopened. Remember, by his own words, he said that we've destroyed the Iranians' capability to enrich uranium. Twice he has said this already.
For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, neither country seemed to exchange strikes overnight. But the U.S. and Iran are still at odds and contradicting one another about the current state of talks. Plus, in the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. military says it boarded a tanker today as part of its blockade of Iranian ports. And the conflict is still at risk of widening with a new front emerging in the Red Sea. This morning, the Iran-backed Houthis struck Saudi Arabian targets on the coast there. For more on all of this, CNN senior White House reporter Betsy Klein joins us now. Betsy, tell us, what's the latest you're hearing from the administration about this war?
Well, Danny, we know that President Trump spent part of his Friday huddling with top advisors